This paper, which I present, does not necessarily include definitions of coping and resilience, because we would have them as we move on. But what I would be doing is to start off with some of the stories that we hear from various parts of the world. And hearing real-life tales of resilience is not only inspiring, but it can also help us to gain a perspective as we face our own obstacles and challenges in life. To qualify my statement, I would like to kind of read a reel of life from various parts of the world. And some of the stories that I have are interesting in their own way, and have always happened as a result of some tragedy of one or the other in nature. 5 years after the levees broke during Hurricane Katrina, the effect of the storm was still evident throughout New Orleans. Schools were struggling. There still remains remnants of trash and debris, houses are abandoned, and many lives in poverty. Despite everything, the spirit of New Orleans, one of the most unique and lively cities in America, when Obama visited for the 5-year anniversary of Katrina, he saw a lot of resilient people coming up with better forms of life and better forms of livelihood over a period of time. We will move on to Ethiopia. When someone mentions Ethiopia, an image that conjures in most minds is of famine and graphic images of starving children. We tend to see some of these starving children presented to us through pictures, through World Vision and other child sponsorship programs. Beyond the vivid World Vision documentaries that we see in the television shows, there is another side, a pastoral society that suffers, but one which also survives droughts. The adaptive strategies employed to minimize risks in times of drought and are reversible and not thought to be detrimental to their abilities to recover once the drought ends. These include temporary migrations, livelihood diversification, and use of other social support systems. There are also some distressful coping mechanisms that people show in pastoral societies to recover from drought. What they do is they change their food consumption. They also slaughter livestock or sell them at distressed prices, and depletion of other productive assets also takes place. Certainly, we would consider them more resilient if they employed mainly adaptive and few distressful coping mechanisms during drought. In a recent study undertaken by Mercy Corps in 2012, a number of associations found access and use of distressful coping mechanisms to be highly correlated, which basically means if there is no government funding when disasters take place, and after post-disaster when there is no government funding, and if people have to rely on themselves, they do cope, but they do take up what is called more distressful coping mechanisms. So in other words, we expect we need to have a peaceful, enabling environment, and if there is a resilience or during drought, what happens is when people do not have they choose the movement that is available to them. If there is no possibility of finding water points for animals, fields and farmlands not being available to them, markets not being available to them, public services being low, and if work and investments in livelihood are low, they tend to seek either relief assistance if that is available to them from the government, or sell their livestock at low price, reduce or change their food habits, and in fact even sell household assets to buy any food. This has been world over recorded, largely from third world countries, and in fact it is also entering into those which are endowed with more and more developmental assistance, or the developed countries. Let's look at Bangladesh. More than a third of world's people in a way live 62 miles off a shoreline around the world. A recent study of 136 port cities found that those with the largest threatened populations will be in developing countries, especially those in Asia. Worldwide, the two cities that will have the greatest proportional increase in people exposed to climate extremes by 2070 are both in Bangladesh, Dhaka and Chittagong, and Khulna, which is also closely behind. Though some parts of the delta region may keep pace with rising sea levels, thanks to the river sediment that builds up coastal lands, other areas will also be submerged. But Bangladeshis don't have to wait decades for a preview of their future transformed by the rising seas. While their vantage point of Bay of Bengal, they're already facing what's likely to be an overpopulated, climate-changed world. They are watched sea levels rise, salinity has infected the coastal aquifers, rivers flood, become more destructive, and cyclones batter their coast with increasing intensity, all changes associated with the disruptions of the global climate. Thousands of people as a result of this arrive in Dhaka each day, fleeing river flooding in the north and cyclones in the south. Many of them end up living in the densely populated slums of Korail, and which hundreds of thousands of migrants already are living there. Dhaka is in no shape to take new residents anymore. It's already struggling to provide the most basic services and infrastructure. The people of Bangladesh have much to teach us about how a crowded planet can best adapt to rising sea levels. For that, there is a nice feature written by Belt, which is called The Future Is Now. Uganda. Beira, which is a Ugandan city on the banks of Rubenia River, separates the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda, east of Beni River. Ugandans and Congolese sell from the same stalls. Both are rural societies, both have something, constantly having a fight between borders and border tensions they constantly have. But what they tend to do is they discuss products and prices in Kinade, which is their shared mother tongue, but carry on transactions in shillings on the Ugandan side and in francs on the Congolese side. The same merchants do their market rounds on both sides of the border. Truck drivers with bananas and palm oil from the Congo cross the border and unload their merchandise in Uganda. But on the other side of the border, they do show their Ugandan ID papers. The same goes for the Ugandan drivers who enter Congo from one of the border regions. When they go through customs loaded with beer, bags of grey cement, cornstarch, and other products, they pull on their Congolese ID, which exempts them from certain taxes. So war or drought, war or border issues, what people are finding is a solution to continue to cope, to become resilient, and this is irrespective of where the governments are doing and what the international trade and tariff issues. I mean, they're not really kind of worried about it. Generally, the officers maintain, I can't tell the difference between an Ugandan and a Congolese when I arrive at the barrier, says an embarrassed agent from Kinshasa who works at the border post. And my question was, does it matter to differentiate who is an Ugandan and who is a Congolese in this context? This is a fundamental example of coping and resilience, especially in rural border villages between one rural state and the other rural state. Over the years, I have heard the two terms coping and resilience resonate quite clearly through various conversations and brave stories that many people have told me. These stories were heroic about some of them, while others were plain and simple. The strategies for mere survival recognize an essential will to thrive, and others recognize a will to flourish and move ahead. And some of those stories you would be hearing all throughout, even in, as we talk through in this particular conference. The central message of, especially in rural, in rural background, in rural situations, that we hear is that recovery from calamity does not involve necessarily restoration to the status quo, but instead requires development of pathways leading forward to possible and preferred futures. In response to both man-made and natural disasters, individuals and collectives face the challenge, what now and what next, amidst the damage and loss of irrevocable changes. We witness, in a way, unanticipated disruptions of different dimensions playing out again and again throughout the globe. What helps people to cope with disaster? What aids their recovery? What factors support capacity for individuals and concerns that suggest like life is not often like still waters? I've always thought there are ripples whose sound and gaze we miss under the still waters. In more simple terms, it is like stress, which is a load, a burden that one can carry without a disruption. But it can tear a muscle or stretch out emotional abilities as we struggle to withstand its weight. Thus, there are sudden acute stresses that we can see or describe, and there are others that we may not feel in the beginning. However, the way we think about stress appears to me as being very much in our control and could make a big difference in how we can handle ourselves at the crossroad of unseen stresses. Coping responses in rural society are also partly controlled by the personality traits that we would have, but also partly by the social context, particularly the nature of stressful environment in which we live. While there are a number of ways by which people cope, most of these mechanisms can be classified largely as part of the adaptive coping, and there is also what we would call problem-focused and emotional-focused coping. There's a lot of theory that's kind of available on that. And last year I had the privilege of writing a book on coping, resilience, and hope building, which is out there for display. And that is written along with a colleague of mine in the United States and a colleague of mine from Sydney. And the kind of articles that we wrote in that primarily were around both the theoretical perspectives and also case studies which are from both the rural as well as urban contexts, and largely from social welfare and social welfare contexts. So one of the things that at some point of time which people have suggested to us is to also look at, in the theoretical world, we also need to look at what some of the models that we have. And the model that people talk about a great deal is the Faulkner-Lazarus model, which is about emotion-focused coping strategies, which is about disclaiming what you have, escape, move on to avoidance, accepting responsibility or blame, exercising in a way self-control, and positive reappraisal. A lot of research shows to us that this sort of coping is possibly more associated with countries which have also accepted the karma or the karmic type of orientation. In other words, there is coping mechanism, and becoming resilient is also associated with a level of spirituality and the cultural aspects that are much more prevalent in those parts of the world. So sometimes it's disturbing to understand that we are letting people become resilient, and they are becoming resilient, and they are coping and they are becoming resilient as only because that is the only alternative that has been, available to them, and nothing else is available. So one of the discussion points that is at this point of time being talked about is, especially in the sustainability literature and in the sustainability world, is there anything that is sustainable? Is one of the major questions which people are trying to ask. And United Nations itself, I think in the 2013 to 2000, the future perspectives that they are trying to in their literature is, has this big line about sustainability, but underneath, it is actually talking in terms of an adjustment or a compromise towards resilience. That means, in other words, we are talking at this point of time a new language. It is come resilience and go sustainability. So it's not really sustainable to talk about sustainability. That is the way in which people are moving the discourse, and there are adjustments that are coming up, because at this point of time, because of the resources crunch that we have, there is evidence to show that people are being constantly asked to adjust and readjust. Not only the governments, the societies, and the institutions that we have are asking for these readjustments, but the readjustment itself is being talked of as a celebration rather than as an outcome, which is an adjustment. Is that a tragedy? It is a tragedy from one perspective. It is also something that is become more of a survival technique at this point of time. So that is one thing that we need to understand, that we should not, it is better to talk about coping and resilience resilience itself, rather than resilience to be part and, resilience to be a word or a paradigm that will, compromise the kind of meaning that we need to have about sustainability. I'm quite happy for the word sustainability to go away from any part of the literature, because there's nothing that is sustainable. What is sustainable seems to be that you survive, you make your own mechanisms, you make your own life, you go on, because life goes on. So you're finding if nobody helps you, you manage to cope. You manage to cope, and over a period of time you become resilient. Whether there are resources within the society or not, whether there's a huge reservoir from which you are able to draw those resources, you continue your struggle and you continue your saga. What I tried to do a few years ago was, is resilience a kind of resource that we can always renew and we can always draw upon in a society? Will there be, if constantly you get, especially in Australia and also especially in Queensland, I have seen it more. Year after, if you get floods, and if we expect the society to become more, and it has to have the ability to become more resilient, then I think people are going to be asking that question. If you don't have anything else to give us, leave us. We will continue our own way. So there is a either you actively associate with a mechanism by which you teach people to go beyond survival, or people survive by themselves. So social work, I think, in the paradigm that we talk of coping resilience, probably finds itself very challenging, because we do require resources. But coping and resilience kind of, is a kind of a paradigm which is asking for inner resources from inside the human being, much more than resources which we could otherwise supply from some other places. As a result, there is, from one perspective, if people deny themselves, and if there's nothing available at that point of time, and if they've gone on to just put it behind them and move on, what kind of a coping would we call that? Probably the psychologists would call it maladaptive coping, and we will also kind of reconcile to such a word, because it doesn't improve the functioning of the individual, but it just makes the particular person remain in a status quo. So we tend to see that over a period of time, coping may actually become a fail as a long-term process, and if coping results in a kind of a resignation alone, and that resignation is very unlikely to help people to become resilient. So if we were to at some point of time try and see a link between coping, resilience, and even to build hope in the society, then you're talking in terms of 2 or 3 different compartments which have some links which have been broken, and if you want the train to move on, there has to be some sort of linkages which are required, and those linkages are associated with both individual-oriented, individual-owned strengths, and also that of the strengths that we have got in the society. So while individualized interventions seek to strengthen persons in resisting and persisting through adversity, sometimes individuals also may require what we would call some sort of a behavioral changes in combination with interventions to affect the immediate social environment of that particular person. And similar views were expected, and similar views were talked about in the review of literature, that a multi-system, strengths-based understanding of family resilience, of group resilience, and of rural community resilience is required in the context of social and cultural ecology with which we actually deal with. When we want to construct a resilience framework, especially for the rural, in our rural society, one of the things that could possibly help us is the concepts that Professor Unger has done both in social work as well as in psychology, which is a two-dimensional construct that concerns itself with the exposure to adversity and resultant positive adjustment. So in other words, there is a big conversation that is happening around that adversity is good. Having a disaster is good in a way, because it does test where we stand and what it might actually produce out of us. If we did not have adversities, it would probably not produce a kind of positive response and a positive society that we would actually need. And some other people also try and understand it in a different way. They say, could we not simulate adversity? Do we really require an adversity? These are kind of things in which will make us think in terms of educational strategies. Probably is there a time when we can simulate adversities and teach people, so that over a period of time, when real adversities strike, there is a possibility of individuals actually using their positive adaptations. One point of view about adversity could define is that any risks associated with negative life conditions that are statistically related to adjustment difficulties, such as poverty, children of mothers with conditions of mental illnesses, families and communities that have experienced disasters. As we know that whether it is in rural areas or in urban areas, we do have all these variations in our demography. So what happens is, when disaster preparedness activity goes on, or disaster recovery activity goes on, some of the variables that we would otherwise want to be very sensitive to, which are connected with mental health, connected with disabilities, some of those things just get washed away, because at that point of time what we are talking about is a maximum feasible minimum program of ensuring that people have a place to survive, and a place where they can actually feed for that particular night, or for a few nights that it can actually take place. So the research that has been done at United States, particularly in the Resilience Research Center, and some of it that is also being done in Sydney, shows that more than just the capacity of individuals to cope well under adversity, often localized to those societies where adversity occurs, resilience as a public resource of solace, which is my area of research, does not appear to be indefinitely renewable. When crisis hits the world today, like Mumbai, Kashmir, Madrid, London, Karachi, Wall Street, and Washington together, this resilience is no longer available as far as the community is concerned. Resilience is better understood as an opportunity and capacity of individuals to navigate their way to psychological, social, cultural, and physical resources that may pull together during a crisis. Most crises certainly provide us opportunities to capacitate individuals to collectively and to also negotiate for life following adversity in appropriate and culturally meaningful ways. Andrew Zolli and Mari Healy in one of their latest books, which has just come out in 2012, Resilience: Why Things Bounce Back, bring in a new definition of resilience in rather simple words. If we cannot control the volatile tide of change, we can learn to build better boats. We can design and redesign organizations, institutions, and systems to better absorb disruption, operate under a wider variety of conditions, and shift more fluidly from one circumstance to the next. And that is what resilience is all about. Now, I'll just go through a couple of slides that I do have. I hope they come up. Now, that's what we are trying to unpack resilience about. Essentially, it's an exposure to adversity, results in positive adjustment. And when we look at the net assets in resilience, we look for the opportunity it should provide and also the capacity that it should actually provide. And as I said, that there is an element of an individual resilience. I've also talked about the primordial recognitions there, that is the ability of individuals to come out even in high-risk situations, ability to build their reserve, and only individuals can create their own banks of resilience. And if there are stories and narratives in the villages and in the rural society that we have got, it is quite possible for us to build around those narratives and move on from one sector to the other. The other diagram, which is about elements needed by all, is certainly we talk about the network factors, which is families, friends, and others, and affiliated skills. And certainly the last, but it's a very important thing that I stress, which is the existential support, which is meaning, value, and life. Some people combine that and call it spirituality. Some people may not like the word as being spoken as spirituality, but otherwise it is asking that question: what do I have? What is it that I would like to have, and what is it that is actually giving me a little bit of peace? Certainly there are always going to be people who need assistance, and there are always people going to be wanting to rebuild their way. And when of course in our society, I've used it in a different context, this particular slide in cross-cultural competencies. That's why you find biculturalism and resilience exists. And the example for biculturalism is myself. I'm an Indian. I've been here for the last 21 years. I have a framework of the Indian values, and I also have a framework that over a period of time that I've generated and utilized here. So what's good here is taken by me, and what's good there is taken by me. So I trans-context my life in such a way that I'm in a position to live and continue and pick up the right things and the right chords. And well, of course, the culture matters in resilience. And this slide will also be available to you, I guess. And what I would do is I would stop with that particular slide, take the questions so that we have an opportunity for raising some conversations around. And I also want to put a little bit of a plug. While the book is available, someone innovatively brought out, since the book is expensive, they brought out a USB card reader. You can have a good look at that, and it's on sale, and it's not too expensive for you to take it with you. Thank you.
Venkat, could you just go through this slide? It's a little hard to read.
Okay. Culture is what makes communication possible. Consequently, culture is the patterns of thinking, habits, and experience that human beings share and that make it possible to understand each other. So I'm looking at culture as an operating reserve in any society. I'm looking at culture as something which provides the capital. It provides us the adequacy of traditions that we have got. It provides the heritage for us. It provides fellowship, fate, as well as history. And it also provides previous wisdom, because that's what culture is all about. The kind of signs the warning signs that we would see is that forces beyond our control are having a heavy influence on the capital provision of culture. Because there are so many changes that come about, as a result, it is not possible for a lot of people to keep on to the kind of values that we have. And over a period of time, the variance, the changes that are brought about in the culture reflect where you are and how much you chime and how much you rhyme with it and how much you would take with it. So it is, again, there are some areas where, of course, because it can get impregnated with other realities, and it has an opportunity to interact with other cultures, there's always some change. Sometimes it is also that changes can, changes bring something good, and sometimes, inactivity in culture can also be very, very vulnerable, and it can be crumbling. So as a result, what is it that you need to do? I mean, one of the last comments that I've had, and which I made along with Dal in Nepal, was about hybrid cultures. What happens to hybrid cultures? Where do they belong? And what kind of sense of identity do they have? So when I read through coping resilience through culture, I come to this kind of a feeling that what's sustainable and what we are talking about is just life. Those words sustainable has no more meaning as far as I'm concerned, because all I see these days is come resilience and go sustainability. That's how the literature is talking to me, or at least that's how I understand the literature, and because they are not making any meaning to me. And that's what it is about.
I studied with Venkat last year on global social work on a global perspective. Again, this is a question just to give you a great chance to talk about what you do with a bucket of money, Venkat. We'll always have natural disasters in Australia, we'll have them across the world. If I gave you a bucket of money from a government organisation when that natural event occurred, what would you spend it on?
Because at some point of time in life, I did work with the government in some program called Family Support Program. I could give an example to that. There was a lot of, there was a time when the government itself decided, this is the money, these are the kind of programs, go and give it to them. So we went there with a bag of goodies and we said, would you like to take any of these things? The people knew that this man will not come back, so they took whatever they could, whether it was useful at that time or not. Time came and we spent a lot of money. A little later, I did an evaluation of my own program in Queensland government, and I sent it away. I called it, that was called family-centered practice initially, and then we moved on to what was called family-directed practice. We asked, we do have a little bit of money. Tell me what is it that we would like to have and how is it we would like to go about. Not only did we save big dollars, but we also enrich the aspirational and motivational capacity of the people. Money can buy certain things. What we need to understand and get into our society here is an inspiration from rest of the world where there is no social security. How do they live? What is it that actually builds them? If there is money, probably they are grateful that that money can be utilized for something or the other. Gratitude is one word, which probably links somewhere else to the spirituality and fate and human life orientations. But it is those kind of things that possibly over a period of time will find more meaning. So give me a pot of money, I'll hold it. I'll not distribute it immediately. I will not hoard it, but I will not distribute it immediately. I will say to the community, this is your money. How do you want to take it? I would not use the word, how do you want to rob it? That's going to be the difference in the jargon that I would use. A strength-based way is to say, money exists. What's your dream plan? What's going to be the outcome at the end of the day? There has to be some sense of regulation. You can't go on building house after house because year after year you have a disaster. There has to be also some way by which we relate to the freedom and regulation. To be free is one thing. To be, your freedom in a way stops when somebody else's rights also come into play. So it is those kind of questions that we need to ask in our society, and a little bit of regulation is fair to ask.
we've only got time for one very short question.
So it was just some observation from what you were saying. I was in one of the towns that was flooded 2 years ago. And initially, the initial response came from a local company. It was family run. It had a lot of employees. And they came in and helped people out of their houses. They did a lot of that initial response. And people thought that was fantastic. And then the local government stepped in and said, no, you've got to stop everything you're doing because it's not by the book. And so they had to pull back. And people got very frustrated because then everything became very drawn out and erratic. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that in terms of, that stifled the local community response when local government came in and sort of took over.
Well, I suppose, the relationship with the local government and the people is a very important thing. A local government alienated for a long time, not really being present until the time of disaster. And obviously is not doing any governance other than just taking care of themselves. The local government bodies and the local government workers themselves, take it for granted that they know all. That makes a big difference. The alienation and the enemy that we still have in our society makes me question, makes me ask you all this question. If we did not have the fine tomorrow in August or September for the elections, how many of us would actually like to go to the polling booth and elect one of these disgusting members of parliament?
On that note.
Okay? That shows that when we have a right to utilize it in a proper way, and we have only choices between two dogs and two cats fighting with each other about nothing, not about the realities, that's a poor choice. Is America a choice where everybody has a holiday and only 20% of the population elects Obama or somebody or the other? Maybe. Is India a choice where nobody elects people, a few hoodlums and few gundas go and print off everybody else's vote there and they get elected? Is that a choice? So it's a question of, if we are looking at from our personal professional point of view, social work has a responsibility in teaching rights and obligations in our society. And that's something that we haven't done well.
Thank you very much.